We continue now at the top of Daf Nun Hamid Beis Meseches Menachos. This is Menachos Daf 55b. On the previous Amud, the Mishnah said that with regards to Karban Mincha that's not supposed to be chametz, even if the shirayim become chametz, that's a violation of a los aseh, and the shirayim means after the kamitza is taken, then the remainder of that Karban Mincha, even if that becomes chametz, again there is a violation. The Gemara asked, what is the source for that violation? And Reish Lakish said on the previous Amud, it says in the pasuk lo seyafa chametz chelkam, and it means even chelkam, even their portion, referring to the shirayim, the remainder, again, lo seyafa chametz, it cannot be baked as chametz. And the Gemara asked, this pasuk of lo seyafa chametz, isn't it used for something else? And the Gemara now is in the middle of bringing a brisa. Again, the pasuk says lo seyafa chametz, you can't bake it as chametz, talking about the Karban Mincha. Matam Alomer, why does the pasuk need to say that? V'halo kvar nemar, doesn't it already say in the pasuk lo seyasa chametz? There's another pasuk that says lo seyasa chametz. What do you need both psukim for? Lefisha nemar lo seyasa chametz, because it says lo seyasa chametz, yachol lo yehe chayev ela achas al kulam. One might think that there's only going to be a liability for one, meaning one liability in all of the preparation of the mincha and causing it to be chametz. Talmud lomar lo seyafa. So the pasuk says lo seyafa, the baking, and therefore by specifying the baking, we learn as follows: afia bechlal hoisa. Afia baking is included in the general preparation of the karban mincha. Lama yatsa. So why is it specified? Lahakesh let's to make the following comparison to it: ma afia miyuchedes shehi ma'aseh yechidi v'chayovin oleh b'fnei atzma. Just like with regards to afia, with regards to baking, so it is miyuchedes. It's a ma'aseh yechidi. It's unique that it is just one step in the process, and we say that there's a liability on its own. Afani avi lishasa v'arichasa v'chol ma'aseh yechidi sheba. So too I include the kneading and the preparation of the arranging of the karban mincha, any part of the step of the process, and leisuye kituf, that even includes kituf. There's a machlokas rishonim exactly what kituf means. Rashi says leisuye kituf shemachlik poneh b'mayim, that he smooths over the surface with water, puts it on the surface of the dough. Afagav delav ma'isa kol kachu, even though that's not such a critical part, but even that leisuye kituf shu ma'isa yechidi v'chayovin oleh b'fnei atzma, still we say that there's a chayiv, there's a liability just for that part. And Rashi explains, this is going on the previous Amud, Menohani mili dechayev v'shirayim. From where do we know there's a liability even by the remainder of the mincha? V'over below saseh, and there's a transgression of a lo saseh, again if it becomes chametz. To mikra de masnisin lo shaminan ala kometz, to la gavoa ozel. From the pasuk that's brought in the Mishnah, we only know this halacha by the kometz, by the fistful, because that goes la gavoa, that goes to the Almighty. Ma'aseh yechidi means ma'aseh chashav b'fnei atzma. It means that it is a ma'aseh chashav, it is a part of the procedure of making the mincha that is considered important on its own. And then the Gemara said la'asuye kituf, to include kituf. Rashi understands, as we said, shemachlik poneh b'mayim, that he puts the water over the surface, alfagav delav ma'isa kol kachu, even though that is not such a ma'isa, that is not such an important part of the procedure. And the Gemara continues and answers the question, Anon me chelkam ko'amrinan. We're saying that we learn this halacha from the word chelkam. Again, lo seyafa chametz, that's used for the Braisa's teaching, that afiyah is bechlal hoisa and lama yotzis. It's to say that on every single step of the procedure of making the karban mincha, there is liability. And when we learned out that by the shirayim also there is liability, that's really being learned out from chelkam. That's not being learned out from lo seyafa. Rashi explains, Anon hach drasha de shirayim mechelkam kamrinan. We're learning out the shirayim, that there's liability from a drasha from the word chelkam, midasama chelkam lo seyafa, from the fact that the word chelkam is next to the word lo seyafa. But the Gemara continues, ve'ima kule lahachi udasa. Why don't we say the entire pasuk is just for that? Rashi explains, ema kule l'shirayim also. Maybe it's all for the shirayim. K'dechsiv chelkam v'lisha v'aricha v'afiyah. And according to that, again, chelkam teaches us the shirayim, and in terms of the kneading and the shaping of the dough and the baking, then where are we going to learn out that you're chayev on all of those various steps? Where would that be from? Again, maybe the entire thing is for the halacha of the shirayim. Again, kulei lahachi udasa. And the Gemara says to that, if so, lichtov chelkam lo seyafa chametz. If it was just teaching us that one halacha, it would have said chelkam lo seyafa chametz. Their portion, referring to the shirayim, can't be baked as chametz. My lo seyafa chametz chelkam. Why is it phrased lo seyafe chametz chelkam, so shamat min atarti. So then we learn both halachas again. We learn this halacha of the afiyah, that each step there's going to be liability, and we also learn the halacha of chelkam. And the Gemara continues, ve'ema, but why do we say afiyah deparat barachmona l'chayev, that on the baking which is specified by the pasuk there's liability l'chayev chadas, that there's a liability for one, but enoch, but on everything else combined l'chayev chadas. So maybe we say l'chayev chada akula, we say that on all of those combined there's just one liability. Maybe afiyah has one liability and all the other steps have one liability. Rashi explains, ve'ema afiyah deparat bakra va'afke min haklal. The pasuk takes it out of the general rule and specifies afiyah l'chiyuva l'chada, to say that there's going to be a liability of one for that. V'yakulu inoch chada, and then on everything else is going to be one liability. V'lo l'chayev tarti, and so then the total is only going to be two. Why don't we say that? And the Gemara answers to that, mishum dahavid davar shaya bechlal. The reason is because this follows the rule. This is one of the Yud Gimel Midos Shator and Nidreshes Bohen, because this is something that is part of the general rule. V'yotzam in haklal, and then it is specified. It's taken out of the general rule. The Torah specifies something that really was already including, that really was already included, meaning the afiyah, the baking, and l'lamed, it's to teach us, and lo l'lamed al atzmo yotz, it's not just to teach about itself, ela l'lamed al haklal kulo yotz, it's to teach about the entire general, and the entire general rule, meaning to say, just like by the afiyah you're chayiv on that alone, so to each step of the process there is liability. But the Gemara continues and asks, ve'ema, why don't we say that lo seyasa klal? We should, instead of darshaning this in the form of a davar shahaya bechlal v'yotzim in haklal, let's do it as a klal uprat. We should say lo seyasa is a klal, that the term lo seyasa in the pasuk is a generalization. Lo seyafa prat, and when it says lo seyafa, that is a specification. And then we would say klal uprat ein bechlal elamasha beprat. The rule is, when you have a klal followed by a prat, we only go by what is specified. There'd only be liability over there, and afiyah in midi achrina lo, and then only liability by baking and nothing else. And the Gemara answers to that, Amar Rabbi Aptoriki mishum dehave klalu prat hameruchakin zeh mizeh. Rabbi Aptoriki says that this klal and prat, meaning lo seyasa and lo seyafe, they are distant from one another. They're not written next to each other. They're in different parts of Sefer Vayikra. V'chol klalu prat hameruchakin zeh mizeh. Anytime you have a klalu prat that are distant from one another, ein donin osan b'klalu prat, then you do not follow the rule of klalu prat. And the Gemara continues, Mesev Ravada Barava. Ravada Barava asks, V'yamri Lokadi, and some say it's unattributed. Uchlalu prat hamaruchakin zemizeh in donin osan bechlalu prat. Is that really true, that when you have a klalu prat that are distant from one another, that we don't make a klalu prat out of that? But that's not true. V'atanya, but we learned in a brayso, V'shachat oso b'makom asher yishachet ha'ola lefnei Hashem. It says that you're going to slaughter it, and this is talking about the seir of the nasi. It's talking about the carbon that is brought by the king. And it says that it's slaughtered in the same place as the ola. Chatos, it is a chatos. Heichon ola nishchetas. Now, where in the Azara is an ola actually slaughtered? We're comparing it to the carbon ola. It is slaughtered bitzafon. It's slaughtered in the north. So avzeh bitzafon. So too, when it comes to the seir of the nasi, it is slaughtered in the north of the Azara. But the Gemara says, anu mikan lemeidin, but do we really learn that from here, that at the north of the Azara we learn from here? V'alo kvar nemer, but there's already a pasuk, b'makom asher tishachet ha'ola, tishachet ha'chatas. It says in general that where the ola is slaughtered, that's where a chatas is slaughtered. That applies by all carbon chatas. So what do we need this pasuk specifically by the carbon that's brought by the nasi? Halamazeh yotza. So why is it specified over here? Lekovo. It's actually to establish it as something that is fixed, that is completely, that is totally obligated. Shem lo shacharoso b'tzafon. Meaning, if it's not slaughtered in the north, paslo, then it is disqualified. That's why we state it in the pasuk v'shachat oso b'makom asher yishachet ha'ola lefnei Hashem chatas. He tells us that it's even disqualified if it's not slaughtered in the north. Ataomer lekach yotzas. Now you're saying that's the reason why it's specified. Maybe it actually means as follows: only this carbon of the nasi requires the north, and maybe nothing else, maybe no other chatas requires the north. Talmud the pasuk says there's another pasuk. It says v'shachet es hachatos b'makom ha'ola. It says you slaughter the chatas in the place of the ola. Zebona av, and therefore this sets a general rule l'chol chatos, for all carbon chatos shetaunos tzafon, that they need to be in the north. And the Gemara now says, Taima dekos of Rachmana v'shachat esachatos. Now, the only reason why we're able to learn this out is because it says v'shachat esachatos, and that tells us again that all chatos require the north. Halav hachi, but if not for that third pasuk that's brought in here by the Brisa, hava amina shezeto and sofan. So I would have thought that this carbon, the soyer of the nasi, requires the north. Vein acher to and sofan, and no other chatos requires the north. Now, why would I have thought that? What is the reason why I would have understood that it is only by the carbon of the nasi and nowhere else? My time, what's the reason? Lav mishum to have a klalu prat. Isn't it because it would be learned as a klalu prat, a generalization followed by a specification? We only include what's specified. V'yafa gav d'meruchak and zemi, even though those two psukim are distant from one another, don and osan b'klalu prat. Still, we learn a klalu prat, and so you see from here that we do learn a klalu prat even if they are distant from one another. But the Gemara continues and says, it's not true, it's not that we would have learned it as a klalu prat, because maskif lo Ravashi asks on this, hi klalu pratu, you think that this is a klalu prat? It wouldn't have been a klalu prat anyway if that's how we're learning. It's actually prat u klalu, it's actually reversed. The prat here actually comes first, and then the klal, vinasa klal mosif ala prat, and the rule by a prat u klal is exactly the opposite, that the klal comes to add on, that it's not only the prat, but even that which is not specified, even that which is beyond the prat, vis rabbi lu kalmili, and we end up including everything. And so therefore it can't be that the Brisa over here needed the third pasuk, because otherwise it would have been a klalu prat, and then we would have said that only the seir of the nasi is included. That's not true. It must be a different reason. Ella rather, tana oso kakashali, the tan of the Brisa is bothered by the word oso, because the word oso is generally an exclusion. It means it and nothing else. And this is what the Brisa was saying. Maybe we should say that this, the so'ir of the nasi, requires the north. It has to be slaughtered in the north, and nothing else requires north. Dekos of Rachmana oso, because the pasuk writes oso, and therefore it has nothing to do with klalu prat, and therefore it's not a question on what we said above, that we don't do a klalu prat if they're distant from one another. And the Gemara continues, V'hashta denafkale mi v'shachat esachatos, but now that we're learning it out from the pasuk of v'shachat esachatos, so now we still have the oso, that seems to be extra. Oso l'me'utei mai, what is oso coming to exclude? Because again, that would have been a havamina, that oso was an exclusion, but now we are not excluding. Now we're saying that all these carbon chatos are slaughtered in the north. So what is oso coming to exclude? And the Gemara says to that, l'me'utei oso b'tzaf, when it comes to exclude, as follows: this one is slaughtered in the north, the ein so'ir nachshon b'tzafon, and the seir of nachshon, that is not slaughtered in the north. And Rashi explains, V'hashta denafkalemi v'shachat esachatos, and now that we learn from v'shachat esachatos to lo amrin on ein acher to and safon, that we don't say that nothing else requires north, ela de nasi, except the nasi, meaning now we're saying that all chatos require north. So oso lamali, so what's the oso for? V'halegel meimar de lemuute shar chatos meikuva kasi, and you can't suggest that it's the oso is to exclude other chatos, that it's not an absolute requirement, that it doesn't cause a disqualification. You can't say that. Shchitas kachim ma'isi tzafon lechol chatos, because in shchitas kachim we actually say north is a requirement for all chatos, bein lemitzvah, bein la'akiv, and that's true as a mitzvah lechatchila, and it's also true as an absolute requirement beperek ezu mekomon and perek ezu mekomon and seir nachshon. And so then the Gemara said that we're coming to exclude the seir of nachshon. That means shehikrivu hanesiim seirei chatos bechanukas hamizbeach. The nesiim, when they brought in the inauguration of the mizbeach, they brought their karbanos, they brought seirei chatos, they brought he-goats as carbon chatos. Ulahachi nakat nachshon. The only reason over here we're specifying nachshon to hu harishon, because he was the first of the nesiim, but we really just mean the goats that were brought by the nesiim. V'hanu mimit de'ein tu'un and safon, and those are excluded. They don't require north to lo bo al chet. The reason why they're excluded is those were chatos, but they weren't brought for a sin. Keshar chatos, like other carbon chatos. And the Gemara continues and says, Kasal gadai dechamina, one might have thought, hoel v'srabe le'inyan smicha, since they are included, the seir nachshon is included as far as smicha, as far as leaning upon the animal. L'srabi name linyan safon, maybe they should be included also for the north requirement. Kamash malon, again, that's what Oso is teaching us, that seir nachshon, again, the seirim of the nesiim, they do not require north. And the Gemara continues, Smicha gufa minolin, and what is the source in terms of smicha? We just said that smicha is required. The Tanya, as we learned in a brisa, v'samach yado al rosh hasoyer. It says that he leans upon the head of the he-goat, l'ravos seir nachshon l'smicha. That comes to include even the he-goat of nachshon for this requirement of smicha, of leaning upon the animal. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda, these are the words of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Rabbi Shimon says, and Rashi explains, v'samach yado al rosh hasoyer, ben nasi ksiv. This is written by the nasi. Umatzi lemichtav v'samach yado al rosho. It could have just said rosho. It doesn't have to say rosh hasoyer, and that comes to include not just the general soyer of the nasi, but also the seir nachshon. And Rashi continues, Tamayud Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Shimon Mefaresh beperek shtei midos. The reasoning of both Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon is explained in perek shtei midos later on, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Nun Vav Amud Aleph.